What up, though? Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to African American Studies 477, our independent study, Economics of Jim Crow. I am happy to have you with me today. My name is Dwayne Barnes, MPA. This is your third week. Then what's up? This is your third week. But if it's your first week, I want to thank you for joining the class today. This course, AAS 477, Economics of Jim Crow, is a course that is doing several things. One is to bring together like-minded individuals who wanted to have a response to what they were seeing politically, socially happening. It's also an opportunity for me to share the passion and the calling that I have to share African American history and African American studies. For those who don't know, it was my major in undergrad at Howard University and at Eastern Michigan University. It's something that I hold near and dear. And as I started to look around at what was going on in our society, I started to see a lot of people worried. They were scared. Didn't know what was going on. And so I said, you know what? With the information we have in the past, we can pull that to the present and we can prepare for the future. So this was originally started as a 4-lecture series. You'll be hearing some about that here at the end of this discussion, where we were talking about the economics of slavery in week 1, the economics of Reconstruction in week 2, and then the economics of Jim Crow in week 3 and 4, where we wanted to center our work around the economic philosophies of Booker T. Washington and his accommodation in this do-for-self perspective, to W.E.B. Du Bois and his talented 10th perspective, and then later on, Marcus Garvey and his nationalist back to Africa perspective. So this is week 3, and I see some good afternoons. Looking forward to the content. That's what's up. So we're going to jump into our conversation today. Well, let me hide this one and let's set the stage. So I'm going to bring up my deck here. And so we'll be going with the deck and away from the deck as we move through our discussion today. We'll have some opportunities for some discussion points and just some reflection points. So this is 477. I'm calling it the Nadir. This time between 1877 and 1900 is known as the Nadir of race relations, really up until the 60s, known as the Nadir of race relations in our country. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to talk about from 1877 to 1900, which marks the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow up until the turn of the century, 1900. I also entitled it One Step Forward and Two Steps Back, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. So as we move into this discussion, I want you to be open-minded. I want you to be ready to receive, and I also want to hear, what you have to say as well in the discussion. So as we talk about this topic from where we left off last time. So where we left off at the end of Reconstruction, the Tilden-Hayes election of 1877, where the North said, okay, we'll take the presidency. And the South said, cool, you can have the presidency as long as you pull out of the South and leave race relations down there up to us. And that's what happened. And so when you got to this point, you had to deal with the new reality of all of the supports for Reconstruction are now gone. The troops are gone. The laws that were put in place through state constitutions are now being rewritten because the Southern states took power back, and they were rewriting those laws at the state level and at the local level. So they took their congressional seats, they took their state legislature seats, and took local control. And then, so that led to the start of what was known as Black Codes. And that's literacy tests to vote, poll taxes, and having to read the state and interpret the state constitution just to get an opportunity to vote. Economically, the land was taken back. So the land that was that freedmen were able to acquire was then taken back. All of the semi-fair contracting that the North and the Freedmen's Bureau were helping that the newly freedmen get involved with these former landowners are out of the window, and other business opportunities are starting to close. So you're starting to feel like a slavery 2.0 situation. Another big part of this time is through tenant leasing. So for any kind of reason, they have vagrancy laws And the vagrancy law said if you found a black man or woman without a job or in the city circle or doing whatever they could, they can enslave them again or send them to jail, because we know in the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished except for as an act of servitude for a crime. So these gentlemen and these women were getting sent to jail for minor offenses. And this was the start of the privatized prison corporation, because then those people who were enslaved or in prison would then go out and have to work the land for free. Also through sharecropping, and we talked about that a bit last week. Sharecropping, a system where I kind of talked about it like payday loans, kind of a thing where you're given a plot of land to service and to get some crops out of, but you're being charged out of the crops that you get at the end of the year. You're being charged for any animals you would need, any seed you would need, any tools you would need, and any other interest rates or interest fees that could be added on to your shoulders. So basically, debt patronage, a level of where you're just going into debt, and never getting out of it. As opposed to a time where you maybe own the land and you could lease that land out to others and make you some money off of it, or just take what you made and go sell it and make your own money. So it was a time where you saw a really big step back. And then there was also the mob tactic of lynching, which is going to be a big part of this discussion today, but not from the typical perspective, one of how we fought against and fought for more eyes to be on it and towards it. So that was, the end of Reconstruction and kind of setting the stage for how we're going to move forward. Let's go to our next one here. So next in the discussion is, so we had a taste of freedom, and I'm going to take this off for just a moment and we'll go back to my presentation for just a moment. We had a taste of freedom. So during the Reconstruction years, we had a taste of autonomy, the ability to move around the way we wanted to a certain extent, or more than you had as an enslaved person. The freedom of movement, the freedom to go and try to find your family, to get married, to just have the autonomy of yourself. As I mentioned earlier, the economics of the fair wages that you could put together, because the Freedmen's Bureau was there negotiating contracts on the behalf of the formerly enslaved. So you got a better deal than you were getting in slavery, and probably a better deal than what you were getting in this Nadir period that we're talking about now. Land ownership, as I talked about earlier, people were able to actually own some land, lease that land out, get the fruits of the crops back to yourself, and build your own economics and your own communities. And then more skilled trade operations, because remember, we talked about in our first week when we talked about slavery during our enslavement period that these enslaved men and women were master craftsmen, artisans, agricultural wizards, and moving the needle forward. So these were people that had a great deal of skills. And we'll see in this conversation how those great deal of skills went into kind of what was next as far as Northern industry and some of the leaders that we'll talk about moving forward. Even more politics. So we had a chance to run for and win congressional seats, state legislature seats, local seats, from sheriffs to attorney generals to all of these kind of different seats that we were able to hold. We knew that education and literacy was big during that time, because prior African Americans or enslaved Americans weren't allowed to, there were literacy laws on the books to ensure that they didn't get an opportunity to learn. And then finally, the cultural, the side of the church, the arts, the freedom of music, the freedom of gathering. So we had that taste of freedom. But with the redemption, like I just mentioned earlier, and the Southern powers taking the power back, we were losing our sense of that. So as a response to that, two things kind of was happening. Okay, we talked about land ownership, sharecropping, and economic exploitation. The role of Black codes and lynching and slowing up our opportunities. And so we're at this moment where we're looking to where we know that, unfortunately, the government forces that helped us get here basically said we're done with that and we're leaving it to you guys. And so we had to create a nation within a nation to try to navigate some of this. And the way we were able to do that, where we used the seeds of what we found in Reconstruction as far as our ability to have a political voice, even though that was almost non-existent at this point, our economic opportunities and our need and want for education. Another way we were able to move is through migration. So I call this period the seeds of the Great Migration. So during this time, there's two things happening. there is a Western expansion happening in the United States. So from about 1903 until about, I'll say till slavery was over, America had a want and a need to expand. And I won't go too deep into this conversation because this is a conversation for another day and another time. But a part of what was going on, you can go back and look at it. The Louisiana Purchase of 1903, which U.S. Got a ton of land from the Mississippi onward to start to build and cultivate for themselves. Not to mention, this land was already owned and cultivated by what we call traditionally now the Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1930, which did exactly that. The Mexican-American War, 1846, which was a fight for the Mexicans were fighting for what we call the Texas territory during that time. And then finally, the Homestead Act it was the Compromise of 1850, which set out a new set of compromises between free and slave state and economic opportunity for Western migration for U.S. citizens. And then finally, the Homestead Act of 1692, which encouraged more exit to the West and provided for a small fee. If you made it to a land and you settled that land and you built that land, that was your land moving forward. So a lot was going on in Western migration as the United States was concerned. Where I want to take my stance on it is, or where I want to take my view on it was the exodusters. So during this same time in history, we had people who said, you know what? I had too much of a taste of freedom, and I have the ability to move now, and I don't feel safe and comfortable here in old Dixie in the South no more. So I'm gonna take up and leave. And so what they did was, they were called the exodusters. They left towards Kansas, and Oklahoma, and the Midwest, what we would call the traditional kind of Big 12 country, if you followed college sports pre just a few years when the conferences realigned. And so this is what I call it, the seeds of the Great Migration. These were people saying, I can't live, if you remember the old Kanye song and Dilated Peoples, I can't live my life this way. They said, I can't live my life this way no more. I got to move forward. And so they went out to Kansas, settled towns. It was about 6,000, or at least 6,000, the numbers change, of people who said, you know what, we're leaving the South and we're moving to see if we can find better opportunities. But this at the same time was kind of frowned upon to a certain extent by some of the Black establishment at that time, because you had people who were still trying to hold on to their elected office, or a former who made themselves leaders during the Reconstruction time, saying, hey, let's not run. Let's continue to fight for what we have here. So some of those leaders we mentioned last time, congressmen, state legislators, preachers, other people were really saying, hey, instead of leaving, let's fight for what we have here. We saw what that fight looks like. We made some progress. Let's not leave what we have here, and let's figure out what we can do down here. And we'll talk about how this division or I wouldn't even say division. Our people have never been a monolith. So we always had different ways of getting things done and different ways of seeing how we could get things done. So those who said, you know what, we're voting with our feet, we're going to get up out of here, and we're at least looking for a new opportunity. So they went to Kansas and these other places in that region, and they established towns, and they were attempting to find that American dream of what Reconstruction showed. And for a time, there was still, some back and forth, but they were able to find places to call theirs and maneuver. What they hoped for was it would be a lot more promising than maybe it actually was. And they found that, Jim Crow was there as well. And it wasn't as promising, but you did get the first seeds of migration away from the South to the Great Plains. And this is going to play a key part in moving forward, because some families and groups of people did find solace away from. So you would go to a place that was maybe unsettled and make that yours, or you would go to a place where people who were there who were open to having you there. And since you still had skills, you still had a way to make money, you still had things that were necessary. Some people were embraced, some weren't. So we were able to establish towns like Cherokee, Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, Stockton and Nicodemus, Bouge, Hill City, Millbrook in Kansas, Lincoln City in Oklahoma, Wellston, Russettville, Boley, Manta, Marshalltown, Porter, Taft in Oklahoma. And so you start, and even in St. Louis in Missouri, so you started to see that there were opportunities there by and large. But Jim Crow was everywhere, so it kind of led us to kind of what we had to kind of figure out what was next. But you had people leaving the South, you had people still back back at home in the South where many were, and the seeds of the Great Migration that would come later, closer to the end of the 1800s, early 19th century. So back at the trap, I like to call it, back at the crib, back down south, there was a revolution happening, and a revolution that had happened that opened some doors. And I'm going to get back to this, but I want to take it off my screen for just a second. So you had the convergence of three kind of things during that time. You had the Black church, which was always a key part of our existence here, for several reasons. One, for control, until we found our own control and found our own way to tap in. Two, we found during Reconstruction and even during Civil War, Reconstruction, and even now, a place where we could actually plan, plot, and strategize, and a place to give not only social, political, and educational, but spiritual nourishment that we needed facing those things that we were facing. So, during this time, however, now the Reconstruction's over, we have our opportunity to navigate forward. The Black church started to be a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of protest, and the larger, now back in control Southern majority, weren't happy with and wanted to keep tabs on what we were doing. But that institution, that we'll find out as we move forward, was responsible for creating the schools that we attended and ended up turning into HBCUs, that were the political hubs and centers of the community, the places where there was a printing press where the press could actually get their information out. So the church was and always have been a core part of our community. And now a quick history. I won't go too deep into the history here, but I want to just provide kind of a context for us to have this conversation. So when we're having this conversation, it was kind of two ends happening. One, the northern missionaries that came south to establish schools and teach the Negro and to northify them and to dignify them, as they would say. And then you had the AME church that would say, we want to kind of do this our way. We want to find a way to do this our own way. So you started to have this kind of a traditional way of how we did things down south, or what was called a slave Christianity. I don't call it that, but that's what it was called, versus a more northern Christianity, Victorian, more respectable, more kind of not what we were used to doing down on the old plantation or down in our own spots. Education became a top priority, and a way this was done was through reading the Bible. So there were reading, having a Bible and being able to read it during that time was a sign of stability, was a sign of kind of you had it going on and you had some future plans and you wanted to move forward, et cetera, et cetera. And so the northern missionaries would start using the Bible as a teaching school, and one way they did it was through Bible bands. And a big part of the early church, and as we still see today, were our women. Black women were a part of these Bible bands, and it was a way for them to, one, build community, two, learn to read, and then three, one thing that our people always wanted was the ability to know what was in that scripture. The preacher or whoever was in charge told you what Genesis said or told you what Jesus said, but they wanted the ability to have that information for themselves. And so these Bible bands that were started by these missionaries started to grow in popularity. It was something that, not only they were doing, the missionaries were doing on their good fortune, but it fed into our want and our need to want to learn and want to have the scripture and want to read anyway. And so, that's one part of it. The next part of it was, in short, the financial independence that our churches started to get. So at a time we were saying, okay, we love the northern missionaries, we love all this stuff, but we want to kind of do it our way. We don't want another kind of stronghold over our shoulder. We want to do it our way. So we started through the AME church. We started to build our own institutions and wanted to do it our way. And a big part of that was for our financial independence as well. And, one of the issues that we were having, though, is during this time, church membership was, 60, 70, 80% women, but the leaders, who were typically those who were elected to office during Reconstruction, ministers and other things, the leadership were men. And as opportunities for men, for Black men to exert their leadership in community started to dwindle, they really started to want to take a hold on what was going on in church. And while you have our sisters like, well, look, we want to be a part of this as well. We don't want to be left on the sidelines, especially because we're raising money. We're funding this thing. We're helping to spread the word. We're doing all this work. We want to be a part of it as well. And so you had this, I wouldn't even say rift, but this growing among our demographics saying, well, you guys did get the right to vote. What do we get in this opportunity as we've been here with you step by step? So as we're growing and as we're changing, this is happening. And I fast forward to, the holiness movement. So during this time, there was a question between, what is the new kind of Christian experience for Blacks in the South? Is it, well, no, I took a step forward. Let me take a step back. Well, prior to this holiness movement, as we were trying to figure all these things out, as schools were happening, the press was happening, all these things were happening, we're trying to redefine what it means to have our own spirituality and our own religion and our own institutions with our own teaching. And so it was one figure I'm going to talk about, Henry McNeil Turner, and I had his picture ready, but I'll put it in our notes as we leave, who was the first nationalist kind of preacher to say, our God should look like us. So if we Negro, then our God should look Negro. Our Jesus should look Negro. This is what we thinking. And that was a big kind of swing in African-American church institution during that time, because up until that point, the Northerners was telling us what it looked like. Slave owners told us. And so our idea of what Christ was or what God was something that someone else told. But as we got into the word ourselves, and as we got into our own ideologies that we were building politically and socially, this was the beginning of some of that nationalist thought around, a Black God and look at having a God that looks like you and serves the people that he looks like. So that was something I definitely want to pull out. It's a lot I'm missing because this isn't my expertise, but I do want to at least acknowledge that. And then lastly, and this is a part just selfishly growing up in this, the holiness movement started really moving around the late 1800s, 1890s. This is through tent meetings and revivals. You got to see healing and the movement of the Holy Ghost and excitement. And I call seeds of the Pentecostal church. And I grew up in the Church of God in Christ, which kind of led that push. Charles Mason, 1897, started the Church of God in Christ, which was kind of one of the early crowning jewels of the holiness movement, and kind of led that kind of movement forward. So that's just kind of a quick kind of tie into just kind of some church history as we move forward. And let me bring this back up here as we can continue our conversation. So the influence of the Black church, like I just mentioned, was by and large, it was the center of what we were doing. So the church was the school. The church was the political meeting. The church was where the printing press was. So whatever kind of business you were doing, even if it wasn't necessarily church business, you were there. And it was a place where we could hide, a place where we could be safe, a place we could teach our own theology and our own ideology to our own people. So it was a place that we used and we navigated for the things that we needed during that time. So this kind of leads us to kind of our next conversation around the press. So as I mentioned earlier, this church being the center, the church having the resources, the church being where we can kind of center our work, that was kind of the birth of the press as well, especially down south. I mean, even in the north, because we'll see later, the places where the first Black papers were able to be started were through the help of the Quakers, through the help of some free Black folks and people who were able to get some means. But it was a source of information. It was a source of culture, a source of survival, and a source of economics for our people. And it was something that we didn't take lightly. So up until that point, we didn't really, we were barred from reading and writing down south, and up north, our opportunities were just starting to form in the late 1850s and 60s as we were moving 30s, 40s, and 50s as we were moving to a time where anti-slavery and anti-slavery journalism was starting to build. So, but by and large in the press, we were virtually, kind of invisible outside of the end that got lynched for doing X, Y, and Z, or somebody committed a murder, or somebody did this stuff. So, it gave a voice and a visibility to a people. It gave us a social and a political standing, because all of those cities that we were talking about where we expanded to, one of the first things we tried to do was put together some kind of communication so we could talk to one another and figure out what was going on, even if it was to save each other. Was it to spread some messages? Where can I find this? Where can I go here? What can I do? It was a way for us to communicate. It was also a way for us to share opportunities. Well, hey, there is a press down in Luxembourg, I'm just saying off the top of my head, and who's looking for somebody who can run it, who can help with this, who can help with that. This is places, this is a safe place for X, for Y, for Z. So it was a place where we were able to navigate. So now we had the church, and now we have our ability to communicate with each other through press. It was also a form of debate. So we had an opportunity now to have some of those intercultural conversations about church, about freedom, about our role, about moving, about all of these other things. So the people who were literate and were able to read and navigate this, they would sit down with the people who couldn't and read what you had. So people would sit down and gather around the person who could read, and they would read whatever paper was during that time. So I want to take this off of my screen and give you just a quick timeline of what it looked like for us, for our press during this time. So I'm going to share to my second screen here. Give me just a moment. Here we go. So African-American press timeline from 1827 all the way to 1900. So pre-Civil War here on this side, on the left side, we had the Freeman's Journal, 1827, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The North Star, 1847. The Christian Recorder, 1852. These papers were all, centered around slavery, anti-slavery, highlighting Black achievement and what we were doing and what our thoughts were on what we should be doing for freedom for African Americans by and large. On the right side, you'll see some of our post-Civil War papers. In 1827, the California Eagle, which we'll talk more about next week, which was one of the most radical and growing papers out west as we navigated out west during the Great Migration. The Philadelphia Tribune in 1884, the Memphis Free Speech 1888, which our girl Ida B. Wells, which I'm gonna get to here in a moment as well, and then the Baltimore Afro-American in 1892. So this is just a quick timeline. So what I'm saying, and these are just kind of, I would always say there's the exception and there's the rule. These were the exceptions. These were the big dogs. These were the ones that gained traction and were able to be maneuvered. Now, there were any city, any county, any settlement places, people started their own, but this is a really big, kind of movement for us during that time, because, during that time, we weren't considered to be readers or people who wanted to share opinions and thoughts. These were proven otherwise. And let me go back to my screen here. So here, too long others spoke for us. So let's talk about the Freedmen's Journal in 1824. So the first Black owned and operated paper in the United States, established the same year slavery was abolished in New York. It published editorials about slavery, biographies of well-renowned Black figures, and pieces advocating for social and political rights. I want to talk a little bit more about that. And so this paper was founded by two, let me get my notes 1 second here. I mean, I do have this off the dome, but it's always good to go back to my notes that I have in front of me as well. Let me see here. I had it right here. Give me just a second here. Here we go. Here we go. The editors, Mr. John Rustwords and Mr. Samuel Cornish, they pooled their money together and they started this paper, which started to sell publications, started to move forward. But, like any two people who found something, once your ambition starts to change, once things start to change, you move forward. So, while this paper didn't last as long as we wanted, it was a splash into the space, and it was an opportunity for us to say, you know what, we can get this going. We can pool resources. We can print. We can press. We can kind of share this information by and large. And so now this is starting to be like, oh, this is happening. This is going. And so then our next endeavor here, Mr. Frederick Douglass, who we spoke about a couple times already, Mr. Frederick Douglass and his, let's see here, and his contingent started the North Star in 1847, again in New York. Told you this kind of started in, where freedom was. And the big takeaways on this one was, because it was Frederick Douglass's paper, his name was attached to it. The VIPs of the day read it because he was one of those VIPs. If we went back into to the anti-slavery movement, he was one of the biggest places and faces in there. He had to horn himself in there because it was something that Quakers were talking about, something the Quaker community was talking about. So he had to push himself in there, and it was known as read by the leaders of the day in Washington and around the country. It was published weekly and sold by subscription. So it was also an economic means. So it wasn't just, we all here, doing the good work for good work's sake. No, we need the money so we can build and to do other things. It was big in the Civil War. Oh, and it merged with Garrett Smith's Liberty paper in 1851 and became Frederick Douglass's All Alone. So just as two case studies, these were two papers that not only showcased our intellectual might, but our economic might as well, because it took a lot to get something pressed up weekly. It took a lot to have access to a press, the funds to be able to, or the skills to be able to sell it and come back and re-up and do it again. So these are just a couple of examples of how we use that time period to not only navigate economically, but intellectually as well. And so this leads me to a conversation about one of our most esteemed revolutionaries, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of gender and sex, Ida B. Wells. And we've, growing up, I heard her name a lot in my learning, but taking a deeper dive, I have a new level of respect and admiration for Ida B. Wells, the same way I do for Sojourner Truth that I mentioned in week one. Same way for Moses, Harriet Tubman in week one, and all of the other strong sisters along the way. But Ida B. Wells came at there was never a perfect time, but her time was a very interesting time because it intersected with lynching and what was going on in the South, journalism and what was going on in the press, and education as it was going through HBCU. So you see this kind of triple threat. I'll give a little information about her story, her details, and then we'll go more into her story. So born July 16th, 1882 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She was one of 8 kids from her parents. She lost her parents in the yellow fever catastrophe of the late 1800s. And she tried her best to keep her family together through her and her family alike. As a profession, she went into teaching and did a tremendous job there. And she, ended up being one of the founders of the NACP. You can see there. But the big kind of, I won't even say turning point, but for me, one of the big turning points in her life was 1883 and 1884. She was on a railway navigating, and she was told to give up her seat in the first class coach. Hear about that a lot. We heard about it here. We're going to hear about it again in Plessy versus Ferguson, and then we're going to hear about it again, or you've heard about it again through Rosa Parks. So these were always typically done as a tactic, but this time we'll talk about this one. She didn't give up her seat, and she said she put her teeth so far in that conductor's hand that he finally let go of her when trying to move her out of there. And she took her case to court, where she won at the local level, went back to the higher court. The higher court struck it down, but it at least kind of showed this vigor and this passion and this ferocity that you would find in her journalism moving forward. Let me take this down as we talk more about our good sister Queen Mother here. So she wrote at the Memphis Free Speech. And one of her areas of expertise that we're going to talk about today was talking about the realities of lynching. So 2 things. One, well, I'll get to this first. So while lynching was a phenomenon, lynching could happen for any reason down south. That's a classic tales of what happened to, well, I won't go there. I want to stay here in this time period. So, lynching was used as a tool to control, to elicit fear, and to have superiority over the new freedmen. So prior to emancipation, if someone wanted to, kill their property, it was not in the best interest of them because they were doing something to their property. But as we moved to not be property and be citizens, they wanted to use that tactic in mob rule to elicit fear and to control. So, there is no typical way that it would happen, but I'll say one example could be they would say, oh man, a black was trying to get involved with a white woman, or he disrespected a white man, or whatever he did. And it would ensue. So without getting too deep into it, because, I want to asset frame this conversation, a lynching was a brutal and what they would say now, a diabolical way to elicit harm on an individual. You would get someone strung up by their neck. They would be their private parts would be cut out and placed in their mouth. They would be burned alive and set aside for people to see. People would cheer. Those who wanted it, the white Southerners would cheer, and it was a great moment for them. Like you saw a home run or a slam dunk in a sports game. That's what it was for them. After it was over, you would see people take parts of a human and take it with them, the teeth, the fingers, the leg, or whatever they wanted, and leave the body there charred as a message to the greater majority is, if you step out of line, this is what you can get. Ida B. Wells said, you know what? I need to know more about this. So when she would read in one of the papers that she would get access to, that in a certain place a man was lynched, she would go down there and talk to the African-American citizens down there and say, what happened here? What happened there? What happened this? What happened? And they would tell her, and she would go back and she would write about it. And she would write about it, one, in fact, but two, also in narrative, and say, well, one example is like saying, well, if you got to lynch all these brothers for dealing with these white women, is the problem the brothers or is the problem the white women? Real talk. And then also questioning motives, questioning the idea behind it, questioning the sanity of it and the humanity of it, and really, really making a spectacle of what these folks were doing, because it was able to be hidden, like I said earlier, because it may have been in the papers down south, but a lot of that wasn't coming up north. And so spreading this message and this word, putting your life on the line in every city you go to, putting your credentials on the line, because they know where you're writing, they know where you're centered and where you published from, which led to in 1892, while she was away in New York, because she would also, always venture up to New York and Chicago, etc., in her work, selling pamphlets, selling the press, and just making her rounds. 1892, her paper was attacked and destroyed. They had plans on lynching her and burning down her business like they often did. Luckily, she was out of town. And and from that point, she didn't return back down south for another 25, 30 years. So she was at that intersection of press, education. She attended Fisk among her other educational endeavors, and she became a strong journalist. So you had these kind of three entities coming together. Another one of my favorite examples from her life, and there's so many, I'm just giving you a couple, was at the 1893's World Fair. So the World Fair at that time was an exhibition that would show all the many cultures of the world in any given city around the world. And this year it was in Chicago. And to tell you more about her and her esteem, she was there with Frederick Douglass, the Frederick Douglass. That's why we say the Ida B. Wells, the Frederick Douglass. They're looking to say, we want to have an opportunity to show the uplift and the progress that our race has made here. We're not just what you think. We're not, or one, we shouldn't be excluded. And if we are included, we shouldn't be looked upon as some of these other exhibits that are going around here. We want to tell our own story. So one thing that they did at the 1873 World's Fair was to sell pamphlets on lynching, on what was going on paper and papers. So sharing this information, selling it, making money, bringing attention to the fact that, one, we are who we are articulate, we have done this, these are the great things that have happened. And so at this world fair, Booker T. Washington Frederick Douglass spoke, and this was his last speech. So this was kind of a changing of the guard. And he spoke about, the need for more representation, the need for opportunity, the need for all of these things. And it was a changing of the guard in two ways. One way, and we'll talk about this more next week, the founder of what would be the Chicago Defender, that at one time was the biggest African-American paper in this country, Mr. John Abbott, was there. You had Ida B. Wells in all of her glory there doing her thing. And then you also had this changing of the guard coming with Booker T. Washington that was coming next. So you had all of these things kind of intersecting at this point. And, we're going to go a little bit further in our story here. Oh, also, I never want to fail to mention, as stories about lynching and black men and black community was happening, Ida B. Wells was also talking about, was one of the first talking about the intersectionality and advocacy for women, which was always a big part of our women's culture. Because, one thing, and I'm not going to get too far into this, but one thing that I think we always have to understand is our women were always in the fight with us. They were on the plantation with us working. They were in the big house with us working. They were at the breeding farms breeding. They were the lifeblood, along with us, of the slavery enslavement movement. And so, we had to always remember that our fight and our plight was never just a one-sided plight, was never just a one-sided function. It always functioned with both sides and both entities. And that's why, as we talk about all of these things that were going on, we can't leave out what our sisters wanted as well, because we were in the fight together. One thing that, kind of made things a bit tough was African-American men got the right to vote first. So, that was, so where men were able to take a step forward and establish them, a new way forward. Those who had been in the fight with us, they weren't able to do so. So as we have this discussion, we always have to mention and bring to the top of mind what was going on for both of our entities. So it wasn't just a black man was lynched yesterday and that's the only problem. Yeah, a black man was lynched, but also a problem is, the black woman wasn't able to X, wasn't able to Y, wasn't able to Z. Feeling constrained, wasn't able to maneuver, wasn't able to do, because we all wanted to get uplifted. It wasn't just the brothers moving by themselves. So I definitely want to bring that into the conversation as well. So this brought us to the educational and economic kind of plight of where we were going moving forward. So as we make sure I'm with the comments as well. So as we move forward, we talked about the black church, we talked about the press, and we talked about education all being tied together. And this is something that, I really want to bring to note here, is that when schooling, well, I'll say this, black education was the product of three things. One, the hope and the dream of literacy and freedom out of the enslaved. Two, federal programming through the Freedmen's Bureau and all of those things that came with post-Civil War society. The AME Church, and the American Missionary Association. And I'm going to bring my second deck up for another quick kind of lesson here. So talking the books, that's what it was called when we were enslaved and we didn't know, we didn't have a really good grasp on what reading was. We called it talking the books because we saw people doing it. And even we saw the preacher doing it. We saw people who were of high esteem able to do it, but by and large, we weren't able to do it. So we call it talking the books. That's why I entitled it that. Humble beginnings. So education in this country or education in the South for African Americans started through Civil War, if you want to be honest, I'll say this, it started, like I said, with those who could steal away and learn to read passages from the Bible, those who were on certain plantations taught to read. Take a Nat Turner, for example, or those who would say, this one, I can show them a little something and it won't be too far. Or back when the kids would play together, I could show you a little something, but just it started in our hearts and in our want to. But from a political level, it started with the Civil War. So enslaved Americans were considered contraband from the Confederates. So in a place where the Confederates ran and left land, or they left there, or they lost battles, we were contraband. So we were taken to work in the northern regimes, whatever they had us doing. And after that day, they would allow for us to start to learn and read. That's from a federal perspective. This is before the Freedmen's Bureau. In that same time, the AMA missionaries would come down south to provide relief, to open schools, and to share the gospel, this northern-fied gospel that I mentioned earlier, with the good old Black folks to try to get them a different version of the Christianity that they had. And then finally, the AME Church, which was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. If I mess that up, let me know. We wanted our own version of, we wanted some autonomy to have our own version of Christianity and to build our own schools without that somebody over your shoulder telling you what you can and what you can't do, what you can and what you can't learn. And then finally, through the Freedmen's Bureau and the programs through Reconstruction. So these schools in these in these church basements that, you know, the AME, the AMA, and the federal government were establishing slowly turned into HBCUs, Morehouse in Atlanta, Spelman in Atlanta, Fisk in Memphis, Tuskegee in Alabama, which were always or usually founded as divinity and seminaries where you were teaching the word and you were teaching teachers to teach. So it was minister and teacher focused. But there started to be a conflict around the vision of educational ministries and what should be taught. Should we learn the liberal arts? Should we have more opportunities outside of just what's there? And that led us to some of our furthering the conversation of what we're going to do around education. So I want to show this as I get ready to transition into a big part of our discussion today. So timeline for HBCUs, you can see here, 1837 is the beginning of the story as it relates to Cheney. And then as we go forward, I want to bring attention to two kind of areas here. One, 1867, this is after the war. These are all pre-war. So 1837, 51, 54, 56, 64. These are pre-Civil War. And then you look here after, you have Shaw, you have Bowie, you have Clark, you have Lincoln, you have Brown Theological. But here in 1867, you get an onslaught, the most at any given year. And I won't take us through the whole list, but I will take us to here, Howard University, HU. You already know. If you was there, you said you know. I already know. And then it brought us here down to 1868, where Hampton was founded, which leads us to a conversation about the one and only enigma of the time, Mr. Booker T. Washington. Woo, Mr. Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in April 5th, 1856 in Hales Fort, Virginia. He was freed there by U.S. troops when they reached that area during the Civil War. I mentioned Hampton, Virginia, because he attended Hampton Institute and Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. He later became the first leader of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which expanded the vocational education and industrial education of African Americans at that time. And then he later came to great prominence under the Atlanta Compromise, which we'll spend a nice amount of time talking about as we move forward. So those are just a couple of things as we get more into Booker T. Washington here. Well, before we do that, the establishment of HBCUs, we talked about their purpose. We talked about how they came and how we navigated through that space. And this deck will be available. Both decks will be available in our follow-up work. So the path to self-sufficiency, I want to stop here and talk a little more about W.E.B. and Booker T. Washington and his exploits. So the legend goes that he walked from where he was from into Virginia all the way to the coast to where Hampton Institute was. Now, Hampton was founded by a Yankee general called Sam Armstrong, where they taught the industrial trades, carpentry, farming, building, laundry work, etc. This former Yankee general viewed African Americans as people who should be trade driven. Don't worry about all other stuff. Worry about this. This is kind of where you are. Get good at this, and this is just where you'll be in this society. Booker T. Washington was one of the prize students there. He rose to prominence on that campus. He found favor with Mr. Armstrong, and in 1888, he was poised to go lead. Hey, it's a job down here. We want to build something like this down in Alabama. Is this something you want to do? And I failed to mention, Up from Slavery is a book that we definitely have to talk about, and we will as we move forward. But as you go there, he was sent down to Tuskegee, Alabama, to build this great institute like Hampton was at the time. Yeah, I just said it was a great institution at the time. However, folks, forgive me. So he gets down to Tuskegee, Alabama, and he's like, okay, where's my institution? Where's this great institution that I'm going to have here? And he looked up, and, classes would be held out of church or held at this place or held at this place, and they didn't really have an institution. But being a product and a star pupil of the Hampton model, he went down there, and he and the students who were, commissioned to come down there, they built the institution with their bare hands. They built the institution. So the parts that were built with bricks and wood from the hands of not only Booker T, but those who were the first rounds of students there. And so there they built an industrial education, a vocational education. And because he was able to find notoriety in the North, he was able to be talked about as this next big leader, this next big thing, this next person. We've seen through our history when, I'll say this, there's a time when opportunity meets preparation, and there are political issues that go around it, but the preparation and the opportunity presents itself. So his preparation and his opportunity presented itself. But at the time, he did have the cosign of Northerners. This is somebody who understands the vocational model. He went through Hampton. He worked under Mr. Armstrong, so he understands it. We're going to give him a chance to build this model out and to see if he can really do it. And if he can do it, we can bestow on him what we hope he can do. So he was sent down there with some bread, with some opportunity, and they made the most out of it. We'll talk more about his stance as we move forward, but you have to understand this wasn't just an idea about, okay, let's talk about self-help in a theoretical way. No, self-help happened through how they built the institution down there. So Hampton, when the first round of people got there and there was nothing there, and the next round of people got there and there were buildings and there were places you can go and study and things that were happening there. Oh, this is what self-help looks like. This is what a vocational education looks like. This is what a trades education looks like. It looks like something you build, looks like something you do, looks like something that can provide notoriety, something that can give you a space. And so they did that. He also was a brilliant marketer. Having been up north, or I'll say Virginia, they do call that Dixie. When I lived there, you went too far, it turned into down south. But he had a way and access to information that maybe some didn't have in other movements. And so seeing him do this, it reinforced a couple things. One, that the vocational education is suitable for the Negro. That's from one perspective. And one, that this is maybe their place where they should be. And these ideas would move forward as we move forward. Because some people felt, these folks are better off in this. Don't worry about voting like you did before. Don't worry about social hierarchy as you were doing in Reconstruction. Focus on this. That way you'll have some utility. And so as we move forward, we'll talk more about kind of what happened with the implications of Tuskegee. Now, one thing that Booker T. Washington had that not many did was a pipeline to the money up north and a understanding of the Southern mentality. So he was a prolific speaker and a fundraiser. So he made his own money doing speaking engagements and navigating his own thing. But he also had contributions from the Northern elite. So, during the time of an industry, many people became rich. I'm talking the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Huntingtons, etc. And so what they were finding was in society, the richer you got, the more you fell out of grace with the common folks. So one way they were able to kind of navigate, similar to how the anti-slavery movement was, is they found causes to invest in. So Booker T. Washington had among his sainted philanthropists, Andrew Carnegie, Collins Huntington, John Rockefeller, Julius Rosewood, Jacob Smith. So you're talking about people who built railroads and banks and institutions up north, businesses up north, industry up north, was giving him a pipeline for two reasons. One, the African-American labor force built the South, and the North saw that. They saw how the South was eaten during enslavement. They saw that. And they said, well, can we tap into some of that labor force? And then also at the same time, if we talk more about what was going on in U.S. history, we fought the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. So we had a problem and beefs with their European counterparts. So the doors to immigration were not as open as they would be later, as you talk into the 1900s and on. So they were looking to kind of take some of this labor force and get them prepared to kind of push the stuff that they wanted as well. And so so you had a time where industry was booming, and 1895, at a big event, Booker T. Washington was called to give what we would know now as his Great Atlanta Compromise. And this is in short. I'm going to drop the link and have it in our information for next week. I mean, for the follow-up. But in short, it was as John Henry Clark would say, it was one of the greatest two-part cons in a good way that you've ever seen. It was a call for investment, but also a call for social and political place. So in a nutshell, it was a call to stay away from politics and social integration, a focus on the philosophy of vocational and economic independence. It appealed to the Northern industrialists and the Southern Democrats. The accommodation, as they called it, was, we'll give up politics and social integration for a chance at economic independence and servanthood in one respect. But the other part of that was saying, remember earlier we talked about there were land ownership was lost, economic opportunity was lost, and political opportunities were lost. So now I'm a sharecropper or I'm tenant leased out because of vagrancy. My economic opportunities were diminishing because, one, I couldn't get hired, or two, if I was, I couldn't make the kind of money I wanted. And then three, just there was no place for me. So the essence of what Booker T was trying to get across was, one, if we can build an economic base and we can not face the issues that we're facing now, and we can have our own farms and we can build our own industries. Let's say the shoe industry was ours. Let's say the building industry was ours. They're building stuff around here, right? What if we controlled that? What if we controlled all the food down south? Because that's where we said we wanted to be. What if we controlled industries and what will be later called vertical integration? And we held these industries, and these were the industries that demanded now that we have a seat at the table, because we have an industry, we have an economic base, and we have a set of skills that nobody else had. That was what was really trying to get across. But on the surface, it was, these black folks gonna remain your servants. They're going to remain under you. They're going to work under you, and they will stay out of your business. And so this was kind of what they call the unofficial start to the Great Migration, because some folks was like, hell no, I ain't about to live this way. I had a taste of freedom. I seen my uncle or my auntie. I heard about people going west. I heard that there's something going on north. I can't live this way. I can't do it. So it was something that was a very crucial and a stable moment. Now, let's take a closer look at what they called accommodation. Washington believed that African Americans should accept the racial segregation and discrimination for the time being. His thought was, look, we just got free as a whole. Let's take a first step, and then the first step will get us to the next step, and then the next step will get us to the next step, and then we got our power. Well, after you get a taste of moving faster than that, you don't kind of want to slow down. Two, and I think this is where we kind of missed the point, or the point was missed, self-help. Washington believed that African Americans should focus on improving their economic situation through hard work and education. Now, during enslavement, we showed during hard work, we built it. So, I pushed back a little bit on that, but I understand where he was coming from. And hindsight is always 20/20, don't get it twisted. So at the moment, I can see where he was coming from. And then the industrial education and the agricultural expertise would allow for us, like I said earlier, to build something. Think about it today. What industries do African Americans own now? Where are we vertically integrated now? They would say, Big said either you sling, slack, crack rock, or you got a wicked jump shot. Well, we didn't own either of those. Jay-Z later said, all us blacks got is sports and entertainment until we don't own them teams, and we don't own them record labels. So what did we have, and what do we have to show for it? So maybe he wasn't as off as maybe we thought at one time. And then mutual prosperity. He believed that the economic progress of the South depended on the mutual prosperity of Black and whites. And I can understand where he was coming from there, because he's saying, well, look, once we get our own little thing over here and doing better than Bubba, now he want to lynch me. Now he want to burn my stuff down. So as they grow, we can grow away from each other and not have to worry about that. So that was this is all in a nutshell. And of course, we could do a whole 4 lectures just on the idea of accommodation and that economic philosophy. So again, vocational education and its emphasis, institutional development of agency, and then the strategic alliances for support. That was, in a nutshell, what the self-sufficiency model of Booker T. Washington was about. Now, however, there was a differing view bubbling here, and we'll talk about this more in our next session. W.E.B. Du Bois, I won't even do all the build-up. W.E.B. Du Bois, who graduated from Fisk, who graduated from Harvard, who studied in Germany. He once, studied under Booker T. As far as I do understand that, as an intellectual, I do understand that. I do understand where we're going here. I do understand why it's important. Would later say, you know what, maybe this isn't the right call for everybody. And are you paying too high a cost for what you've been given? You got this great institution doing these great things, but there's other things happening that you can't speak out about. Well, what we found out are in Booker T. Washington's, not in his book Up From Slavery, but in his papers that were published, we saw that he was taking them folks' money and putting it towards anti-lynching, taking that money and supporting cases, taking that money and hiding folks, taking people and putting people in position. And he showed that, though I'm getting money with these folks, they ain't my people and I don't feel like they are. I'm just doing what I got to do to try to build my race, uplift my race the way that I know how. So W.E.B. had a different spin on it, and I understand where he was coming from too, because he's saying, well, look, for those who were fortunate enough like me and other people who were able to go to some of these Fisk and Howard and all these other places, there should be another route for us. And as segregation moved forward, we got a chance to see that there should be other opportunities as well. And one thing they would say, it was a fight, it was a debate between these perspectives. No, we were never a monolith of people. So you had to have solutions for different parts of our demographic. Even today, there will be some that are able to scale the mountains and go as high as you can. But there are people who will need an education that will provide them a living today, and we can build on that for tomorrow. So that was, something that I really like to take hold of when we think about the Booker T. Washington. I call it self-reliance. Some call it accommodationist perspective. So I said a lot there. I have a little bit more to go, and I want to take a step forward and say we talked about the Black church and how it was the centerpiece of everything we were doing, and it always had been, since our time here. We talked about the press. We talked about education, how we were able to navigate during those periods as well. And this is all during, from 1877 to 1900. Now, but there were also economic opportunities that were afforded to us in many different ways as well. So there was the Tuskegee model of a vocational education, which was important, because if you think about this, let's take a step back and think about it. So, while we are in segregated cities, those who were close to HBCUs or close to water ports or close to places where African Americans still had holds, you had cities that needed more than just a vocational education. You need somebody to have a bank so we can put our money into. You had to have somebody, a doctor or a nurse. You had to have somebody with insurance who could help with that. You had to have somebody who was a photographer, somebody who could help with the in the domestic sciences, somebody who could help with the agricultural sciences, and those who were lucky enough to get a liberal arts education. You needed teachers, you needed preachers, you needed more than just the vocational side. So in some places you did need some of that stuff. And there are cases that we have, and I want to talk about here moving forward. We're going to move a little more quickly through this than we would any other time, because one is supposed to be an hour. But I know we were going to go a little bit longer. And because this is on demand, we're going to allow for those who missed this part to continue forward. But I definitely wanted to showcase, as we talked about here, our economic pathways as well. So empowerment through institution and through economics as well. So let's take a trip over to this side. So a source of information, culture, survival, and economics. That's the theme of how we moved. And let's talk about a couple case studies here. So William Pettiford, born 1920, born January 20th, 1847, a pastor, among other things. He served the 16th Street Baptist Church, and we'll talk about that more, and we'll talk about civil rights, for about 10 years. But in 1890, he founded the Alabama Penny Savings Bank, which turned out to be one of the biggest financial institutions of the time. It even made it through the Great Panic of the 1890s and stayed around until about the turn of the century. But by 1897, he was said to be next to Booker T. Washington as one of the most influential and powerful Blacks in the South. And I'll have more of this information in the review notes. And then I want to talk about Capital Savings Bank, 1888 in Washington, D.C. If you remember from a couple of lectures ago, or maybe the last lecture, the Freedmen's Bank was the first opportunity for African Americans to put their money into a banking institution. We saw through terrible ownership and management, everybody's money was squandered. And so for a long time, the money we had, we put under the mattress, so to speak. We wasn't messing with all that. But again, Washington, D.C., closer to the north, HBCUs everywhere, or not every, Bowie and Howard, or would be Bowie, would be Howard, would be Virginia Union, Hampton. You had a different kind of clientele up there, and they started a bank specifically for African Americans. That just over 4 years, deposits grown to $300,000 back then. That's not even adjusted for inflation now. It provided access to capital for growing Black businesses that you couldn't get anywhere else. So not only was it an institution where we could keep our money, it was an opportunity for us to build into other institutions, like I was talking about earlier. You needed the other kind of businesses, the barber shops, the florist, the photographer later as it came on, the undertaker and his business, the funeral homes, the libraries, the teachers. It was an opportunity for money, and it rode out the tide during the economic fall of 1893, and it stayed open until 1902. So another really good example of that here. Let me take this down and get to my next one here. And this will be my last one. I'll save my next case study for the next lecture. So this is a very interesting as well. North Carolina Mutual Insurance, the oldest and largest Black-owned life insurance company in the nation, and it began in 1898. North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association in Durham, North Carolina. It started doing business in 1899 to relieve the distress of the Negroes. John Merrick, who founded it here in this picture, was a barbershop owner, and he served as the first president. It flipped the industry on its head, because up until that point, well, let me take a step back. I'll say this. Insurance on African Americans wasn't new. Property owners had to be their property. When enslaved Africans were coming on boats from through the Golden Triangle, those boats were insured. So we've seen insurance on African bodies. The only difference with this was insurance for us and by us. We can also talk about A.G. Gaston a little bit later on, who said, you know what, we can put ourselves in position to not only help us, but help the next generation and keep businesses alive that aren't just necessarily the agricultural and the vocational industry focused businesses. So those are just a couple of case studies. You'll get more details in the follow-up that we'll have that I send out after the course. So this takes us to what our next conversation will be. So our next conversation is going to center around the turn of the century, 1900, until about World War I. The reason why I mentioned earlier, so we're going to add one more session. It was supposed to be 4. Next week would have been 4. But we're going to add one more after that, which is going to take us from the end of World War I to civil rights. So we're going to put World War II, the Depression. No, we're going to put Prohibition, the Depression, and up until World War II, and to the beginning of civil rights in our next conversation. But the reason why I wanted to split them was the Great Migration was a phenomenon in and of itself. It did several things. It took millions of Americans from the South to the North, the East, and the West. And it also took our ideals and allowed for things that couldn't bubble up in the Jim Crow South. It took it to the North, but then it also kind of exposed how Jim Crow was any and everywhere. The last thing I want to talk about in this case, and I'll talk about it more in our next one as well, is 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that, I do want to take a couple moments on this. It was a case that I really want to bring some just quick attention to and its impact. So Plessy versus Ferguson was a situation where Mr. Plessy, a man who could pass for white, found his way in a streetcar or a train in the white section and was kicked out due to race. Because remember, the 14th Amendment provided equal protection under the law. The Civil Rights Act of 1873 gave for accommodations, public accommodations, but that was killed a little bit later with the re-rise of the South. So they were trying to see if equal protections could happen here. To make a long story short, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that in 1896, as long as there are separate but equal facilities, then segregation is the law of the land. So you ended out the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s with segregation being the rule of the land in America. And so as people moved from the South to the North looking for brighter futures, they were given a very sour pill, but that sour pill never stopped our appeal to want to move forward and go up. So next week, we'll be talking a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois and his plight. So we talked about what the accommodation and the do for self Booker T. Washington perspective is. Next week, we'll talk more about the talented 10th and the other new Negro philosophy that was coming out of World War I. And we'll talk about the Great Migration in more detail to talk about what that meant just for people moving, how our press was able to kind of lift that up, how industry was able to kind of help buoy some of those things, and then some of the pushback that we saw as we moved northwest and east from the South. So I'll leave you with my final thoughts here. This period during our history was one that showed that 2 steps back still doesn't stop our want to move forward. It showed that we still had the ambition and the heart to get that American dream of freedom and access and opportunity. And it also showed how creative we could be in building a nation within a nation and still finding our way forward. As we move forward through these times today, we have to also consider that same grit and that same opportunity that we have in front of us. We're living in tumultuous times, but it's nothing that our people haven't seen before. And we have to figure out how we want to navigate forward. Next week is going to be a really good conversation, and I can't wait to have us for week 4 as we talk about the things that I just mentioned. I want to thank each and every person for sticking with me today and staying with us through the course. This information will be found on this YouTube page where you are. It's going to be on my Facebook page, and I'll send out the link again to the AAS 477 Facebook page where we put some notes and we put the video lecture. I want to thank you guys again for joining. This has been a great discussion, and I'll see you again next week, same time, same place, different topic, but we still moving forward. And then we'll talk about how we want to navigate the last conversation and then what this class will be doing moving forward. So thanks again for your time. You will get both decks and all the supplemental information included in the outline. This has been another great discussion. You ain't got to go home, but you got to get the heck off this live, and I'm going to get off it too. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll catch you next week. Peace.